you do if you were a 30-ish American woman living in Paris with your French husband, 3 small school-age children? You're finishing a degree in philosophy at the Sorbonne. It's 1967, and the Vietnam War is breaking your little American heart. I found and joined an organization of Americans in Paris who were already part of the anti-war movement. And my task in this movement was to interpret between visiting Americans and the Vietnamese political delegations in Paris. And at the time, we thought that war was never going to be over, but it finally was. And at that point, I had a call from some people for whom I'd interpreted, who were the founders of an American think tank, a progressive research institute. And they were keen to found another research institute in Europe and asked me, would I help? And I said, I'd be very happy to help. And I'm happy to say today that that institute is still there, and that the people it has brought together from all over the world over the past 40 years has been a constant inspiration for me. I'm still attached to it. Our first project in this new institute was to prepare a report for the World Food Conference in 1974, held at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And our report was called World Hunger, Causes and Remedies. The 2 principal authors were former Chilean ministers of land reform and agriculture. And they were in exile in Europe because of the US-sponsored coup d'etat by General Pinochet against the Salvador Allende government. And they had chosen Latin American helpers. So I was the only native English speaker, and my job was to put the report into fluent and easy to understand English. Well, we took the report to Rome, and the first time that we saw anything, it was to notice the 2 largest delegations were those of the United States and of the agribusiness interests, the lobbies, if you like. And they had a common line, which was, our industrial model of agriculture is the most efficient in the world. We can produce more than anyone, and it is our job to feed the world. Well, I still didn't know a whole lot, but I certainly had learned enough from the team to know that this was completely irrelevant to the problem of hunger in what we then called the Third World, the southern countries, developing countries. Because if you have no land to produce your own food and you have no money to buy it, you're going to go hungry. It doesn't matter how much food is produced throughout the world. Hunger is not a question of techniques. It's not a question of having chemical inputs and purchase seeds and expensive equipment. It's a question of social and political policy, and it depends entirely on who has control over the resources. So I came back from that conference and was fired up with the idea that hunger was needless, it was scandalous, and something had to be done, and I wanted to help spread the ideas that were in our report. So I started work on my first book, which was called How the Other Half Dies, The Real Reasons for World Hunger. And I started, at the end of the introduction, I put, if it takes you 6 hours to read this book, somewhere in the world, 2,500 people will have died of starvation or hunger-related illness by the time you finish. And I have to say that today, there are still 800 million to over 1 billion people who go hungry, depending on the year and what the prices of food are. There's been progress in China, but there is still an enormous amount to do. Well, to my great surprise, my first book was a success. So I went on reading and writing and speaking about food and hunger problems. And in 1979, a quite extraordinary event happened. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista progressive revolutionary movement won the civil war against the dictator Anastasio Somoza. And they took over the government. And the first thing they did was to seize all the land that Somoza had taken for himself, which was nearly 25% of the total. And they redistributed that land to landless laborers, poor farmers, co-ops. And here is social justice in action. Within 2 years, not only were the Nicaraguans feeding the entire country, not only had malnutrition been reduced to practically zero, but they had produced a surplus of their main crops, which were corn, beans, sorghum, and rice. And the government wanted to export that surplus and asked me, would I help them find the markets where that might be possible? And of course, I accepted. However, Ronald Reagan had other ideas. Ronald Reagan had taken over the US presidency early in 1981, and his plan was to round up the Somoza militias, train them in Honduras, and send them back into Nicaragua to take down the Sandinista government. And the Contras, as they were called, did go into Nicaragua, and they began murdering countless people in the countryside. And pretty soon it became virtually impossible to have a normal farming life and to produce food without interference. So, of course, the surpluses were depleted, and my report became superfluous. Well, meanwhile, a number of us food and hunger scholar activists from North and South had set up an informal network, and we decided to meet in late 1984 to take stock of what had happened since the World Food Conference 10 years earlier and define our priorities for the future. And at that conference, all of the friends from Latin America, Asia, and Africa were saying to me, Susan, you really ought to write a book about debt, because debt is the biggest contributing factor to hunger in our countries. Well, I said, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. I'm not an economist. I don't know about money and banking, and you better look elsewhere. But they kept insisting. So I thought, well, I ought to give it a shot. It's my duty. So I started reading up on the question, and what I discovered was that the countries of the South had been borrowing quite lavishly at very low interest rates, and they were principally using the borrowed money to import large quantities of armaments, oil, goodies, consumer goods for the upper and middle classes, and to build what we used to call cathedrals in the desert, one in the Ivory Coast, white elephant projects that had nothing to do with development. And sometimes the money was simply stolen and sent north to bank accounts in Switzerland or elsewhere. And that was the signal for the creditor countries. They put up the interest rates quite alarmingly, and many countries in the South fell into arrears. They couldn't keep up their payments. So that was the signal to send in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to become the lawgivers and the enforcers of new policies, which they called structural adjustment policies, but which we would call today simply austerity policies. So the first thing the bank and the fund did was to tell many governments that they had to switch into cash crops, because that way they could sell them on the market, they could earn hard currency, and that was the only kind of currency that the creditors would take. Nobody wanted your shillings and your pesos and so on. So a great number of countries were trying to export at the same time a quite limited range of goods: coffee, cocoa, tea, cotton, so on. And naturally, the prices went down for everyone. So that wasn't a very great success. And at the same time, the bank and the fund were telling governments, you have to cut back your budgets, especially your social budgets. You must tax goods even if they are of basic necessity to the poor. You have to make health and education paying propositions and privatize all your public services. So you can imagine that between the neglect of food crops and these poverty-creating measures, it wasn't a surprise that economies contracted, hunger, unemployment increased. And in the 80s, we called it the lost decade for development because very little had been invested previously in health and education and genuine development policies during the borrowing period, and then it was too late to do anything about development. And even in the mid-90s, in sub-Saharan Africa, the African countries as a whole were paying back $25,000 every minute in debt service. Think of all the clinics and the schools you could build and staff with $25,000 every minute. And we heard terrible stories. For example, the mothers in Brazil who were soaking newspapers in water to feed to their children, to give them the illusion of a full stomach. And the mothers in Africa who were taking up prostitution in order to keep at least their sons in school. The daughters were taken out. They couldn't afford to educate girls. So my reaction to this social disaster was two books. One was called A Fate Worse Than Debt, and it was to explain that the poor were being called upon to make terrible sacrifices in order to pay back a debt to which they had contributed nothing and from which they'd never benefited. And the second book was called The Debt Boomerang, and that was mostly to explain to the North that the Southern debt was no good for any of us because it was drying up markets in the South for Northern goods. It was increasing ecological destruction, especially deforestation, which was massive, and as you know, that's a big contributor to global warming. It was promoting great flows of cocaine into the United States and Europe. And in general, thousands of people were desperate to migrate. Well, I learned two things from this work on debt. The first is hard to take, but it is the truth that no amount of human suffering in and of itself is going to cause policy to change. And the second one was more personal, because that was to tell myself that it was time to move on from the subjects I'd been working on for 15 and some years and learn a great deal more about the powerful institutions, such as the bank and the fund, but also about the ideology of neoliberalism that lay behind those institutions. And at the same time, I joined what's called the alter-globalisation movement, working mostly on banking and finance, tax havens, climate change, subjects like that, and working on power structures in the North. Well, I meet a lot of very well-meaning people who genuinely want social and ecological justice, but they seem to believe implicitly that it's possible to simply have good ideas and make good blueprints for policy and you're home free. But that has never been the truth, and it's a huge mistake to forget that unfortunately there really are forces out there, adversaries out there, who have no intention of allowing anyone to do anything which might conflict with their interests. Who am I talking about here? I'm talking about the extremely rich, the 1% of 1%, if you like, The transnational corporations, the banks and the finance markets, and the governments, the politicians, the policymakers, who are governing mostly on their behalf. What I call the Davos class, if you like, taken together. And we have to understand that to do anything concrete, we've got to deal with those adversaries. What does this mean for scholars? Well, I think it means that the social scientist who is responsible has to recognize that scholarly objectivity is completely impossible. There is no such thing as neutrality in the social sciences, and should take a position in favor of the poor and the victims of injustice. And I say, study the rich and powerful, not the poor and powerless. The poor already know what's wrong with their lives, and if you really want to help them, you should give them a better idea of those who are keeping them where they are. And that goes for not just the people who are directly suffering from injustice, but for all those who want to help them wherever they may live. So let's assume that we can pretty much know what we need to do, and we can even know how to do it. My list would have to include getting the banks back under control, because according to researchers from the Bank of England, $14 trillion was spent saving the banks, and normally they ought already to be nationalized or socialized with that amount of public money. Close down the tax havens. Tax Justice Network tells us that between 21 and 32 trillion is stashed by rich individuals and corporations in the tax havens, 80-some jurisdictions. And if we could get our hands on that money and tax it properly, we would be able to solve all the problems on the planet. We need binding codes of conduct for transnational corporations, and we need debt workouts that do not destroy entire societies, as is happening today in Greece. And finally, I believe that the critical concept that scientists call self-organized criticality and popular books call tipping points are a very important concept. They work in a lot of natural systems. The question is that in that system, things are being added to it all the time, and the system grows more and more stressed until suddenly, at some unpredictable time, there is a moment where the system topples, it breaks down, and is forced to reconfigure itself at a lower level of stability. And I see no reason, since this works in natural systems, why it shouldn't work also for political and social systems. And I keep working because I believe that in a social system which is also receiving constantly new elements and is growing more and more stressed all the time, anyone, I might add an element which could be that unpredictable moment and provoke the system to break down, reconfigure itself at a different level of stability, which could be more just and more socially and ecologically livable. I might be that element, and so might you.